At its peak, Rome wasn't just a city or even a nation. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a single, unstoppable machine. Stretching from the fog-soaked hills of Britain to the scorched sands of Mesopotamia, the empire controlled roughly a fifth of the planet's population through a combination of brutal military discipline, ruthless engineering, and an almost obsessive devotion to order. Roads connected cities that had never spoken the same language. Aqueducts fed fountains in towns that had been tribal villages a century earlier. For nearly 200 years, this system worked so well that historians later called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But peace built on conquest has a hidden cost. It depends on conquest continuing. Once the legion stopped expanding into new territory around the 2nd century AD, the constant flow of slaves, plunder, and tribute that had financed Rome's economy began to dry up. Emperors still needed money to pay soldiers, feed the poor in the capital, and maintain the bureaucracy that held everything together. Their solution was to debase the currency, quietly reducing the silver content in coins until inflation began eating away at trust in the entire monetary system. A loaf of bread that once cost a few coins suddenly required a fistful. Meanwhile, the empire's sheer size was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Messages from the eastern frontier to Rome could take weeks to arrive. A crisis in Gaul might be resolved or might spiral entirely out of control before the emperor in Italy even learned it had begun. Provincial governors, military commanders, and ambitious generals realized that distance gave them room to act, and sometimes to rebel. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire entered what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year stretch during which more than 20 men claimed the imperial throne, many of them murdered by their own troops within months of seizing power. Plague swept through overcrowded cities. Persian armies pushed into the eastern provinces. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers with increasing frequency, testing borders that had once seemed impenetrable. It would have been reasonable, watching all of this unfold, to assume Rome was finished. Coin hoards from this era, dug up by archaeologists centuries later, show ordinary citizens burying their savings during moments of panic, never returning to retrieve them, silent evidence of how unstable daily life had become. Trade routes that once moved grain, wine, and olive oil across the Mediterranean grew unreliable, as piracy and local warlordism crept back into regions that had been peaceful for generations. Instead of collapsing outright, though, Rome found one more burst of resilience, and the man who delivered it would reshape the empire so completely that it became almost unrecognizable. The Emperor Diocletian, who rose to power in 284 AD, looked at the wreckage of the crisis and concluded that no single ruler could realistically govern an empire this large. His solution was radical. He split supreme authority between 4 men, a system known as the Tetrarchy, with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior successors, each overseeing a quarter of Roman territory. It was an attempt to solve the communication and defense problems that distance had created, and for a while, it worked. Borders stabilized. The currency was reformed. Bureaucratic reorganization made tax collection more efficient, even if it also made daily life more rigid and controlled than it had ever been under the Old Republic. But dividing power among 4 ambitious men rarely ends in lasting harmony, and within a generation, civil wars between rival claimants had broken out again. It was Constantine, one of these competing strongmen, who eventually reunified the empire under one ruler in 324 AD and who made 2 decisions that would permanently alter Rome's trajectory. First, he legalized and eventually championed Christianity, transforming a once persecuted minority faith into the empire's dominant religion within decades. Second, he founded a new capital on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. This eastern city, perfectly positioned to control trade between Europe and Asia, would soon eclipse Rome itself in wealth and importance. This shift planted the seed of a permanent split. By 395 AD, the empire was formally divided into western and eastern halves, each with its own emperor. The western half, centered on an increasingly impoverished and depopulated Italy, struggled to defend its borders. The eastern half, built around Constantinople's enormous wealth and defensible geography, thrived. While the East would go on to survive for another 1,000 years as what we now call the Byzantine Empire, the West had no such fortune. Germanic peoples, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and others, were no longer simply raiders probing the frontier. Many had been pushed westward themselves, fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns under Attila, and they arrived not just as invaders, but as desperate migrants, seeking land and safety inside Roman borders. Rome, weakened and short on soldiers, increasingly relied on hiring these very groups as mercenaries to defend itself, a strategy that worked until it didn't. In 410 AD, Visigothic forces under their king Alaric did something no foreign army had managed in nearly 800 years. They breached the walls of Rome itself and sacked the city, an event so psychologically devastating that contemporaries described it as the end of the world, even though the empire technically staggered on for decades more. The symbolic end came in 476 AD, when a Germanic military leader named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager with the almost mockingly grand name Romulus Augustulus, a name that combined the city's legendary founder with its first emperor. Odoacer didn't bother naming a new Roman emperor at all. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and declared himself ruler of Italy, governing in the name of the Eastern Emperor rather than as Rome's successor. For most ordinary people living through it, this wasn't a single dramatic moment of collapse. It was the final, almost anticlimactic step in a decline that had been unfolding for generations. What's remarkable is how much of Rome didn't actually disappear. Roman law became the foundation for legal systems across medieval and modern Europe. The Latin language splintered into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. The Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome itself, preserved Latin texts, administrative structures, and a sense of continuity that outlasted the empire by well over a millennium. Roads, aqueducts, and architectural techniques continued to be used, and in some cases, copied without anyone fully understanding the engineering, for centuries afterward. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, which historians retroactively named the Byzantine Empire, didn't fall in 476 at all. It continued, with its capital at Constantinople, governing, trading, and defending itself against invaders for nearly 1,000 more years, until the Ottoman Turks finally conquered the city in 1453. In a very real sense, Rome survived the fall of Rome. The lesson historians keep returning to isn't really about barbarians at the gates, even though that's the dramatic version most people remember. It's about how empires rarely die from a single fatal blow. They erode through currency collapse, administrative overreach, political instability, and the simple, grinding difficulty of governing too much territory with too few reliable institutions. Rome didn't fall in a day, a year, or even a century. It dissolved slowly, leaving behind fragments that would go on to shape an entirely new civilization built, almost invisibly, on its bones. Even today, walk through almost any European capital, and you'll find traces of that long, unfinished collapse. A road built on a Roman foundation, a cathedral standing where a temple once stood, a legal phrase still spoken in Latin in courtrooms thousands of miles from the Forum. Rome's empire ended. Rome's influence in many ways never really did.